So this week, just to start off, this is a little bit of an aside. It's been an interesting week for sure, and the things that I've learned this week. One, I guess it started on Wednesday before things were beginning to break, and even the week before that, when I had learned of some of the things that were going on, it was a little anxiety-provoking. And for a couple hours in clinic on Wednesday morning, I wasn't really sure if I had done the right thing or not, if I should have just been quiet and let things go. And I felt a God-given peace soon after that, and really felt that He was there with me. And I actually haven't been emotional about it all week, so I'm not really sure why I'm too emotional about it now. But you know, one thing I learned is that He is good, and He is my protector, and He's my family's protector. And not because of any way that it turned out. He doesn't promise us that things are going to turn out well and going to be good, because that's just who He is. So I'm left with trusting Him and being obedient to Him and leaving outcomes to Him as well. I mentioned to somebody in an email when they asked how I was doing. I said, well, you know, God has gone before me, and He's come after me, and He's been with me when I've gone out and when I come back in. And that's all I can ask for. So thank you for your prayers, and I'm just ultimately thankful to God, and He is really worthy of our praise and our worship. So I don't know how I'm going to get through this today, because it might be a little bit of a thought salad. I hope not. I hope I can be clear. But I wanted to give a little background first. We're in Amos 2, 4-16. Just a little bit of history, and I might be repeating what Dave had repeated earlier when he introed Amos. Judah under King Uzziah, they were pretty politically and economically prosperous. Jerusalem, of course, was their political and religious center, and they had successfully rebuilt after some civil conflicts with Israel in the northern kingdom, to the point where Judah's army was now 300,000 plus men, which, if you look at the map, Judah itself is not very big. To say that they've got an army of 300,000 is pretty significant. So at the time of this economic and political revival, they were strong. There was also briefly some religious revival under Uzziah, although not complete. And then if you look at Israel under King Jeroboam II, Samaria, in the middle of Israel, there was their political capital. Bethel, in the southern part, was where they had a temple and a center of worship, and also in Dan, in the northern kingdom, or the northern part of the kingdom, they had a center of worship. And they were absolutely at the height of their political, military, economic prosperity. This was the apex of their nation, or their national history. Jeroboam had extended their borders back to the north to where they were initially after the Conquest of Canaan, to where they had taken back Damascus. So they were very, very prosperous, very, very wealthy. And there were some, if you look at the map there too, there were some trade routes that ran along the Mediterranean coast. There was an international coastal trade route. It's not on the map, but it runs basically from the southern part along the western side of Judah, and then there's the King's Highway that would run along the Dead Sea and up along the Jordan River into Israel and up towards Damascus. So these were major trade routes that brought wealth and prosperity, especially to Israel. Judah didn't benefit quite as much from these, but especially to Israel at this time. So they had a very wealthy upper class, and I mean extremely wealthy upper class. Those would be people that today you'd be seeing in, $250,000 sports cars, or, cars that were, the cost of a house for a normal person. They owned luxurious palaces. They had summer and winter homes. They had these opulent parties and feasts. And then yet there was this very poor lower class. So there was a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor in Israel. And I think that's an important distinction to remember as we go through this part of Amos. And then there's Amos, who is prophesying at this time from about 765 to 760 BC. And I think to myself, why did God choose Amos for this role? It's kind of an unusual prophet in the sense that this wasn't his primary job, that this was more of a secondary role that God had kind of taken and plucked him out of what he was a farmer, he was a businessman, a bit of an entrepreneur as well. And he came from Tekoa down in Judah. So also interesting, he brings somebody from Judah to go up to the northern kingdom to prophesy to them, where there's still a lot of animosity, so but also his rural farming business experience and lifestyle, hardworking person comes up and he witnesses what's going on in Israel, in the opulence and the oppression, and I'm sure that really was a distinctive point for him to see those things and understand, like, this is not right, and God's giving him the words to speak. And so his life experience was really a stark contrast to what he witnessed in that moral corruption and the selfish luxury. And I think that's an important distinction too, that God blesses some materially, that there's going to be rich people, there's going to be poor people. So it's not so much that some people have more than others that makes God upset. It's that, what are they doing with that? It's that selfish luxury, that self-seeking, self-serving behavior that is just what God does not desire. So these wealthy people were then oppressing the poor and using that to maintain their wealth. So Amos also must communicate what God said, whether it's unpopular or popular. So he's bringing a word to Israel, and of course they didn't want to hear this. They're doing really well. What is this Amos guy telling us all this stuff? And we're very successful. We're very prosperous. So he had a very difficult job. So, and the question then is, how do you give bad news to someone when they think everything's going great? So everything's going well in their lives, and how do you bring that bad news? So he started, just to look backwards a little bit, with 6 oracles against the nations in chapter 1. So the surrounding nations, if you look at your map, those nations were all neighbors to Israel and Judah. You had the Philistines with 3 major cities there that were fairly successful, but these were sworn enemies to Israel and Judah. You had Edom in the south, which is Esau's descendants. You had Moab and Ammon, which are the descendants of Lot and his incestuous relationship with his daughters. And then you also had Syria in the north as well. All of these were enemies of Judah and Israel. And so these judgments on their neighbors that God and Amos at this time were pronouncing was acceptable to Israel. That Israel would say, okay, Tom mentioned this last week, that Yes, they deserve that. Right. So he's starting to build an argument in chapter 1. These nations had broken their own moral standards. They are without excuse. That their conscience was going to convict them. We see that in Romans 1. That there's something about our conscience. Whether you are follow after God or not, you still have a conscience. And I think that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God. That there's something in us that knows what is good and what is evil. There's something that convicts us. Now, that conscience isn't perfect. That we need the Spirit to help us discern. But there's still something in us that knows what's right and wrong. So God is weighing them against their own moral standards and their conscience. And he says they deserve justice. So Israel thinks that's acceptable. But the noose is tightening around them as they start to learn about what's happening to their brothers in Judah. That God brings that up next. So that's the next step, as we find ourselves in verse 4 of chapter 2 with judgment on Judah. Israel may be starting to think, okay, this is getting a little closer to home for us here. And I think also something to think about when you're looking at Judah and Israel here. What's even worse in my mind is that these nations around them did not have any specific necessarily instructions. God had given Judah and Israel specific instructions on how they were to live. So keep that in mind as you're reading through this. And let's start in verse 4. It says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they have rejected the law of the Lord, and have not kept his statutes, but their lies have led them astray, those after which their fathers walked. So I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the strongholds of Jerusalem." And just looking at the pattern of this too, he starts with "for," and then he says "because," and then "so." "For" is announcing the certainty of judgment. He says, "I will not revoke the punishment." The judgment is certain. This is the pattern he's followed in chapter 1. He follows again here in chapter 2. And then "because," this is the why that they are under judgment. And this is what happens. This is the punishment that they will receive. So this is the pattern that follows here in chapter 2 as well. And then also looking at 3 transgressions and for 4, I read that and I kind of wonder, what's that really mean? It could be some rhetorical device, but I did read in one of the commentaries that the ancient rabbis would have understood this literally, that this was a finality of judgment for 3 transgressions, and that God was willing to extend grace for 3 transgressions, that he's a patient God and he's a merciful God, but for the 4th, that confirmed that they're unrepentant, that their heart was hard, and so then they would be judged. So therefore, Judah would be consumed for breaking God's law. And if we look at Leviticus 20 to 22, it says, "You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out." Seems to be pretty clear there what God expects, that you shall keep my statutes and all my rules and do them. In verse 4, not only just keeping statutes, but he says their lives have led them astray. And that, not only did they not follow God's law, that they were led astray by the lies of their false gods. Like Dave mentions, there's some idols that are also involved. They worshipped our Lord, but they also had some idols. And the lies of the false gods, what are the lies? False gods are just a piece of stone and a piece of wood. How do they lie? Well, the lie is that they could actually do something that they were worshiping something that was just a rock or a stone, that was something made by human hands. So the lie is that false god could actually do something. So they're following after the lies of their false gods, the lies that have led them astray. So it's very clear, and even just this brief section of what God has in store for Judah. And then he moves into Israel next in verse 6. Judgment on Israel in this section 6 through 16. And it really describes Israel's arrogance, their depravity, their lack of justice. And if we look at verses 6 through 8, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample on the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. So there's a lot of things in there that he's laying out, some charges against Israel. And essentially, the charges are those courts. One of the main charges, the courts who were responsible for maintaining order and upholding justice and in protecting the innocent, they were not fulfilling those obligations or duties. They were colluding with the wealthy in their favor. So you have people who are being sold as slaves for small unpaid debts. If you look at the beginning of verse 4, they sell the needy for a pair of sandals. So those who couldn't repay a small debt were being sold off into slavery. They were selling the righteous for silver. The righteous were those who were honest and good and could pay, but needed time to pay. They couldn't pay all at once, and they wouldn't even give them time, so they would sell them as well for their debts. So this was justice that was denied them as their creditors colluded with the courts against these people who were in need. So this is, I think this is the primary charge. Now there's certainly others. We have the sexual promiscuity that mocks God and profanes his name, in addition to taking advantage of the poor. They also took restricted items as collateral, that they would take the garments of the widows and the poor against God's specific instructions. They would take these restricted items as collateral. And if you look at Exodus 22, 26 to 27, says, if ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, in other words, as collateral, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body, and what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. So a clear instruction from God not to take your neighbor's cloak, that is what keeps him warm, that is his comfort. And a second thing is that God knows what's happened. That he says, if that person cries out, I will hear it. That he is a personal God and a just God. So clear instructions there. Look at Deuteronomy 24, 10 to 13. When you make your neighbor alone of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. And in verse 17, he goes on, you shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. There were certain things that they were not allowed to take in pledge. A millstone, because you needed that to grind grain for flour to provide food for yourself. You were not allowed to take the cloak of the poor man or the widow or the sojourner, the person who's traveling, the migrant traveling through your country. So Amos points out the disregard of God's law, which requires them to generously care for the poor. So it's pretty clear. Like I said, what makes this even worse is that Judah and Israel here especially were aware of these things. These were specific instructions that God had given them. Let's also look at Deuteronomy 15:7 to 11. Sorry, I should have kept my finger in Deuteronomy. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the seventh year, the year of release, is near, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and you cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and all that you undertake. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. So again, God's just pointing out this generosity that for the poor is what is required of his people. And they have been ignoring that. And not just for a short time, and not because they didn't have the means to help, but because they were selfish. They were taking things for themselves. And to even worse here, the instructions to God's people, Israel and Judah, throughout Leviticus is God says, be holy for I am holy. That he keeps saying that over and over and over again. And he doesn't just give them a general be holy, because then you're left like, well, what's that mean? He actually gives them what that looks like in the Torah, in the law. He gives them what does that look like to be holy? That they were to live distinctively. They were to be set apart for works and service to God. That they were to look different than those neighboring nations that Amos had pronounced judgment on. But yet, they didn't. They looked the same. That with the same logic, the same ethic that God applied to them, he's also applying to Israel. Because they had not followed after him like they were instructed to do. Also, one last charge is that worship included recognition of other gods, just like Judah, that we talked about. They had brought idols into their worship, and for what? Again, lies. That these were things that could do nothing for them. So we said Amos actually takes an aside here. We had that for because so. Well, he's had the for and because already here in verses 6 through 8. But then in 9 through 12, he says, well, here, let's take a look and see what God has done. So he sets that against the backdrop of God's character and God's gracious acts, his care and his blessings for them. It says, yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, those whose height was like the height of cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. Also it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, and led you 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up some of your sons for prophets, and some of your young men for Nazarites. Is it not indeed so, O people of Israel, declares the Lord, that you made the Nazarites drink wine, and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. So, instead of immediately announcing punishment, Amos goes next to, here's what God has done. These are his gracious acts for you and your people. This is why you have the blessings that you have. That God is blessing you, he's caring for you, but this is, in turn, how you respond. So, the conquest of Canaan, obviously, if you remember, when the spies went out and came back to Joshua, it said that the people were tall, and they were big, and they were strong, so we can't fight them. We can't. But God actually went before them and destroyed the Amorites. And then also the Exodus and the time in the wilderness, that how God provided them. And these were things that were part of Israel and Judah, that they would have heard these things over and over and over again and understood what that meant for God to care for them. And his gracious acts towards them, that his protection and blessings, that was just ingrained in who they were. But yet, they forgot and pushed those aside. That there were these distractions, that prosperity, almost they turned a blind eye to God as a result of being, I think Julie mentioned in her prayer, being comfortable. And then also, he graciously gave them guidance through his messengers. In verse 12, he says, you made the Nazarites drink wine. The Nazarites were ones who would make vows to set themselves apart, to consecrate themselves even more so, that it would be a reminder to the people that this is how you are to honor God, to follow after him. And they encouraged the Nazarites, or intimidated them even to break their vows that they had made before God. And also commanded the prophets to not prophesy. It just demonstrates their total lack of commitment to the Lord. That God would be gracious enough to remind them, give guidance to them, to give instruction to them. And also, I mean, just to remind us, we have an instruction book in front of us. We don't have any excuses either. We've got it right here. We know what God requires of us. So Amos demonstrates the inconsistency of Israel's current social behavior and their worship in light of God's character, and which was also revealed by his past actions. And that worship is so important too. And I think about even who was Moses' brother? Aaron, sorry. I was thinking Eli, but Aaron. So Aaron's sons, there was a time, if you go back into Leviticus, that they had offered strange fire before God. That God said that there is a way to worship me that is acceptable. And it's not a worship produced by man. It's not a worship produced by drama or theatrics or whatever. It's a heart thing. That this is how we come before God and we worship him. That this is a heart thing. That we are prepared to meet him as we come and worship him. He doesn't care what you wear. He doesn't care what you look like. That acceptable worship is to come in faith. To come in faith, trusting him and knowing who he is and who you are in relation to him. So, Amos is just bringing this to light, and even that last part that I didn't mention, in the house of their gods, they drink the wine of those who have been fined, in verse 8. So they take the wine that had been given, they had taken in pledge as collateral from those who had nothing, and they poured that out as a drink offering during their sacrifices. I mean, just blatant disregard for who God is. That they, when you're coming for a sacrifice, it should be something that's costly to you. That you pour out a drink offering, that's something that costs you something. So they're taking something that they had taken from somebody else that God specifically said they should not have, or at least done so out of intimidation and oppression of others. And it's just blatant disregard of what God has required of them. So therefore, behold, I will press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves presses you down. And if you look back, he talked about the need of being trampled by the head of the poor being trampled in the dust. That's where God said, I'm going to press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves presses down. Flight shall perish from the swift, and the strong shall not retain his strength, nor shall the mighty save his life. They had a very strong army, like we talked about, a really strong army. So they thought, we're in a good spot. We can take care of ourselves. And God's saying, it doesn't matter. The mighty will not save his life. He who handles the bow shall not stand, and he who is swift of foot shall not save himself. So all these things that they think are their protection, God's saying it doesn't matter. Nor shall he who rides the horse save his life, and he who is stout of heart among the mighty shall flee naked in that day. So the brave, the courageous warriors of Israel will flee like scared little dogs in light of God's judgment. So Israel's powerful army is going to be crushed. Their swift, strong, and brave warriors will fall. What they think is their protection and what they have put their faith in will not protect them. That God's judgment is coming, that it's final. So, things that I've been thinking about this week as far as, Israel is really no better, despite having instructions from God specifically, than the surrounding heathen nations, that God has asked them to live distinctively, to be set apart. But they're no different than the people around them. And I think we ask the same question of us. Do we look different? Are we set apart? Consecrating ourselves for works and service unto God, that we might bring acceptable worship to Him too. That God's judgment is also just. He lays out an argument that these are the reasons why, that His judgment is just and it's not arbitrary in any way. That God does not do things just to press down people, but He has a judgment that is just. He's also patient and gracious, but His judgment is certain, that those who reject Him will be judged, that there's no middle ground. There's no in-between. You can see it clearly here for His chosen people in Judah and Israel. There's not an in-between. That His judgment is certain for those who reject Him. So there's a sense of urgency, I think, for us in this current age, that just like Israel, that success can obscure our vulnerability. That there's some comfort in the pleasures that we have, the material benefits that we have in life, and we're all wealthy here in the U.S. I shouldn't say all, but most of us here in this community. I think there's needy everywhere. God says the poor will be with us always, but we live in a country that is wealthy and prosperous and strong. And Israel had no idea that they were 25, 30 years away from just being completely obliterated and wiped off the map. In 722, they were carried off by the Assyrians. except for a small remnant, they were no more. They had no idea that if they were the height, the apex of their greatness, that was yet coming to the end, that they were falling off the cliff. They had no idea. The collapse of their nation was absolutely unthinkable to them. So, a sense of urgency for us, and as Dave mentioned, as we pray through Micah here this morning, that we're in a very similar position, I think, that we may not even be able to recognize our vulnerability. And we'd be speaking more about the church than anything, that God has blessed us in the church with freedoms to help restrain evil in this world. That's why He's placed us here. So, are we performing or doing the things that God has asked us to do? Obviously, speaking the truth, but also going out and proclaiming His truth to others so they might know who He is and come to believe in Him and follow after Him in creating disciples. So just a sense of urgency that I have with this here, this passage. Any thoughts? That's all I have to say. Any thoughts about this passage?
I think it's interesting, the connection between Micah and when God says before of what He requires of us, He says He has told you, oh man or oh mortal, what is good? And then there's the requirement that comes after that. It seems like in this, it's anything that God had said was good, just like Eve and Adam did, they switched it to what they thought was good. And so then they can't meet the requirements because they've changed the thing that denotes what is good, and they've said it's what we want. And I think that's what I do in my own life. I'm like, oh no, this is better. And I think that's what we've done as a church. This is better. Let's, celebrate celebrity pastors, or let's, just protect ourselves and not become them, the world, and stay unstained. And it's not how God said it's good. So I think it's interesting to see the things that, the Nazarites, they operated this way and that was good in God's sight. And then they said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let you do that. And it seems like that's the theme throughout that passage, is it's once they've flipped everything that God says is good and operate out of that, they're not able to meet the requirements of acting in justly, loving kindness, and doing mercy.
I think the one thing that I was kind of noting here is when we were talking about healing earlier, and I think I wrote down a note that God turns things around. And just as I was making notes, it's just when we got here to 10, God will destroy our enemies. He will bring us to the wilderness, in and out of the wilderness. He will raise us up and clean our hearts. And only through Him can we find the strength and sufficiency just to persevere in Him alone. I think that's what stood out to me, is that God really does turn things around, and I felt that personally this morning before we came, that just turning over to Him, I felt like He gave me strength, and I think you experienced that much this week too.